again, looking at different prakim in the Maharal, the Sefer Netzach Yisrael, we were in the middle of Perek Lamed Dalet. Again, one of the things that when you learn Maharal that you need to do is the Maharal usually has, at least in every chapter, a single theme. There's a theme. And then the Maharal has to go through different Mamari Chazal that either support the theme or contradict the theme, and he has to answer it. Now the Maharal's theme in Perek Lamed Dalet is actually a relatively simple idea, but the idea is contradicted by different texts, and that is that the period of Mashiach has to be a period of total achdus, the total unification of the Jewish people under one melech. That's what Mashiach means, right? Mashiach means the achdus of Am Yisrael. And part of that achdus means that all 12 tribes, or 13, it depends, the notion of 12, when you count Levi, you count Ephraim and Menashe as Shevet Yosef. When you don't count Levi, so then Ephraim and Menashe are counted for 12. So altogether, there's really 13 tribes. And that's merumas in the word echad, because the gematria of echad is actually 13. But be it as it may, this is the Maharal's overall thesis. The thesis is not a complicated one, and that is the ultimate malchus of HaKadosh Baruch Hu in the world, meaning the echad of Hashem echad, is when you have the 13 shvatim that are living together. Right? So that's thesis, that Mashiach, by definition, has to be a tekufa of the complete unity of every segment of Am Yisrael, and it's inconceivable that there would be a shevet missing. Okay, so the problem basically is that we do have this issue of the lost 10 tribes. So the Maharal brings a number of Makairis that go in different ways. So there are really 3 different Makairis that he brings. So I'm going to go a little out of order just to summarize the Makairis that the Maharal brings. The first Makar is a Machlokes in Sanhedrin, which is in the Mishnah, Daf Kuf Yud, in which the Tanakama says, Aseres Hashvatim, Ein Asidim Lachzor. The 10 tribes that were exiled in the time of Sancheriv are never going to come back. They are lost. Shenemar, and this is the meaning of the pasuk at the end of Devarim, V'yashlichem el eretz acheres kayim hazeh. Hashem has cast them away to another land like this day. So the Tanakama darshans, like this day, Mahayom holech v'eino choser. This day is gone. This day will never come back. Right? Monday, whatever date and year is gone. Avheim hochim v'einam chosrim. This is Divrei Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Elazar has a different drasha using the same lashon of the pasuk. Mahayim ma'afil umeir. Right, the day after it gets dark gets light again. Avhein shafei laleim. Even though the 10 tribes were darkened, asida loher lahem. Okay. So that's machlokus number 1. Are the Aseres HaShvatim going to come back, or they are not going to go back? Now, the Maharal will say, Vayter, it happens to be La Halacha. I'm not sure why it's called La Halacha, but La Halacha, he says, Vivadai Paskin, they will come back. But L'maisa, Rabbi Akiva says not. So the question that the Maharal is going to grapple with is, how is it Yitachei that Rabbi Akiva seems to visualize a messianic redemption where so much of Klal Yisrael is not going to be connected, right? That's going to be the question he's going to grapple with. Now, the second text that he deals with is a Gemara, again, in Perek Chelek, which is earlier than this Mishnah, that simply asks the question, Laheichen agli lahu. Where were the 10 tribes exiled to? Right? They were exiled somewhere. Where did they go? So that's a machlekes hamayraim. It's not in the Mishnah. Mar Zutra Amar li Afriki. Mar Zutra says Afriki. Afriki sounds like Africa, and the Maharal will at least assume that in his Havamina. He's going to go back. They were exiled in Africa. Now, this actually fits, of course, the famous tshuva of the Radvaz. The Radvaz lived in the time of the Beis Yosef, Rav David ben Zimra. And the Radvaz is the famous tshuva that says the Ethiopian Jews are descendants of Shevet Dan. Now, whether that could apply hundreds of years later is another question, but at least B'Shas Maisa, he said they're from Shevet Dan, and that actually fits the Mandi Amr that says that they were exiled to Africa. Okay? Rabbi Chanina Amar, Lahare Slug, which we have no idea where that is. Maharal just says it's further because each later Mandi Amar is being Maisif. The mountains of Slug. Okay, we'll come back and see why that text is important, but that's the second text, which tries to give a physical location. Lemaisa, the Gemara itself is very schwer because Mehechi Tesi, that they were exiled to a single location. I mean, one would have thought exile could be many places. Why? But of course, Africa is a big place. Africa is also not a single place, but okay. Now, the third text is actually a long medrash, right? So the first two passages are from the Gemara. The next passage is from Yalkut Shemaini. Again, just a little bit of information. The Yalkut Shemaini is not a medrash of Chazal. The Yalkut Shemaini is a compilation of midrashim on Torah, Nevi'im, and Kesuvim from Rav Shimon of Frankfurt. He was a Dayan in Frankfurt going back to the 13 or 1400s, after Rashi already. And it goes mamish in order. Yalkut is a big medrash. It goes Torah, Nevi'im, Kesuvim, and he will be malakate on every pasuk, everything the Gemara says, the Yerushalmi says, the Medrash Rabbah. Not every Medrash, otherwise there's no sense in making an anthology that just reproduces every single Medrash. But he picks. Now, the thing about the Yalkut, though, is that the Yalkut, the Baal HaYalkut, had access to many midrashim that got lost. Many midrashim did get lost. So as a result, you might say that probably 80% of the Yalkut is from midrashim that we have: Bavli, Yerushalmi, Medrash Rabbah, Medrash Tanchuma, Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer. But 20% are mamish, things we don't even have. Right? So the Yalkut remains a very, very important source. And here the Maharal quotes from the Yalkut, although I see in the footnote that the original source was a Pesikta, which is already a medrash from the time of the Tanoim. And it basically says, Gimel Golios Nasu B'Aseres Hashvatim. The Aseres Hashvatim were exiled in 3 different places, meaning unlike the Gemara Sanhedrin, in which they either all went to Africa or they all went to the Hare Slug. He says they were divided into 3 groupings, although we're not told how was this. Was some tribes, or a single tribe was divided? And it says the following. Group 1 was Golsa la Sambatyain. They were exiled right across the Sambatyain River. Sambatyain River, although the Gemara does not mention it. It's an interesting thing. You will not find any mention of Sambatyain in the Bavli, and I believe not the Yerushalmi either, but Midrashim talk about Sambatyain. Sambatyain is said to be the river that is impassable. The current is so strong that it's throwing up rocks all the time. You can't cross the river. The rocks are going to kill you, but every Shabbos, the river rests, right? So if you wanted to visit the Aseres Hashvatim, you'd have to figure out, you have Shaila about it, but you have to kind of be there before Shabbos and be able to cross the river on Shabbos. So it says, Group 1, Gol Sola Sambatyain, which we mean right over the Sambatyain River. They were there. V'achas Golsa Lifnim Misanar Sambatyain. A second group went further than Sambatyain, and the Medrash explains the same distance you have from Eretz Yisrael to Sambatyain, which we actually don't know, will be the distance of group 2 from Sambatyain further out. So that's double. So essentially, they're twice as far as the first group. And the third group went Golsa Ledafna Shel Rivlasa, to the suburbs of Rivla. Now, Rivla is a city that is mentioned in Tanakh. It's a Babylonian city. In fact, Nebuchadnezzar had his military capital there. And here, though, the lashon is nivla sham. They were absorbed there. We're going to have to see what that means exactly. Okay. And the idea, now the Medrash goes with the idea that the Shvatim are going to go back. And it says that's why Yeshayahu has three expressions where Hashem says, Asurim Tzu'u, the prisoners shall leave. That refers to those who are Nesunim B'Sambatyain. And then the pasuk goes on, V'lasher b'chayshech higalum, and those who have been exiled to the darkness, they shall be redeemed. Those are those that are further from Sambatyain. And for those who are nivlu b'rivlasa, so here's the lashon: Hakadosh Baruch Hu oiseh lahem mechilais milmata. Hashem is going to make subterranean caves from Rivla to Eretz Yisrael, and Haim Hochim Ubayim, and the Jews who are Muvla in Rivla will go under those subterranean caves, Ad Shehein Bayim Tachas Harazesim, until they will be right under the Mount of Olives, Harazesim, right? You know, Harazesim is east of the old city, right? You have what is called Nachal Kidron, the Kidron Valley, and then you have the Harazesim. Okay, and there is an old Messiah based on a pasuk that Mashiach will be Niskala B'Harazesim. But here the Medrash is saying the third group of Aseret Hashvatim are going to travel through a subterranean tunnel till they reach Har Hazesim. And when they reach Har Hazesim, HaKadosh Baruch Hu will be standing on that mountain. The mountain will split, and this population will emerge from under that mountain. And this is the meaning of the pasuk, because in one of Yeshayahu's haftarahs of comfort, the Shiva Dinechemta, the 7 haftarahs of comfort. So Hashem personifies Yerushalayim itself as wondering, where did I get all these kids? I didn't know I had all these kids. V'yamart bilvavech, speaking to Yerushalayim, you will say in your heart, Mi yalad li yasela, who gave birth to all of these children that are coming out of the mountain? Vani shechula v'galmuda, I was bereaved and lonely. Gola v'sura, I was exiled and turning away. V'ela mi gedal, who raised these children? Hein ani nisharti levadi. Again, this is very poetic. The city is talking. I thought I was alone. V'ela efohem, who are these? Right, that's going to be the great miracle of the traveling under the tunnels. And it goes on. The Medrash ends that HaKadosh Baruch Hu will say to the Shemayim v'Aretz, why are you just watching this? Why aren't you rejoicing? When Knesset Yisrael went into Galus, you mourned with Klal Yisrael. As the pasuk says, the Shemayim became dark. Now you have to rejoice in their Geula, and that's Yismechu HaShemayim. Again, it's a very poetic, very beautiful description of Geula. But analytically, it's a little difficult. I mean, because if you're somehow describing the return of the 10 tribes by this subterranean cave, why is that only for group 3? See, with respect to group 1, Sambatyon, and group 2, that is Rachaik mi Sambatyon, it just says Hashem will bring them back. Only the ones that are Muvla, we'll have to define that term, B'daifna shel Rivla, then we have this special thing of Mechilais, subterranean caves. And what exactly is Muvla mean? And how is that? In other words, there's something different about group 3, because group 3, whoever they are, we have no idea which segment of the 10 tribes it is. But group 3 is the only one that is described as Muvla. The other ones are not described as Muvla, and they're the only ones that are described as Mechilais, which would indicate, as Maharal will develop, there is some connection between being Muvla and needing the Mechilais to escape, that the other groups, which were not Muvla, did not need the Mechilais. Right? So Maharal is basically just juggling all of these different Midrashim or Gemaras, And let's start with the first point. The main problem to his thesis is, if Mashiach requires that there be achtos, then how is it yitochen that Rabbi Akiva maintains the Aseres Hashvatim are not Asidim Lachzer? Okay, so the basic answer is actually quite simple. There is a Gemara that says that after the exile of the 10 tribes, Yirmiyahu went back during the reign of King Yoshio, who was a righteous king, and he was machzir the Aseres Hashvatim. So l'chaira, that seems to contradict the idea. In fact, it contradicts both opinions. One opinion says they will be brought back, and the other says they won't be brought back. The din that Yirmiyahu was machzir said they already were brought back. Right? So the Maharal says it's a davar pashut that Yirmiyahu was not machzir everybody. Yirmiyahu was machzir some. Maybe some of them didn't want to come. So it turns out that based on the Gemara, that Yirmiyahu was machzir the Aseres Hashvatim, and once you interpret that to mean some, but not all, so everything becomes miyoshev. That the machlokes Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Eliezer is only legabe the Aseres Hashvatim that Yirmiyahu was not machzir. So even Rabbi Akiva that says Aseres Hashvatim are not asid and lachzor, that's referring to those who did not go with Yirmiyahu. And on that, Rabbi Eliezer says they're going to come back too. Okay, we'll talk further about that. But hakol moedim, that there was a chelik of the Aseres Hashvatim, and we have to assume it represented all the tribes, that Yirmiyahu was machzir. So once we understand that the whole machlokes, Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Akiva, is only legabe the Aseres Hashvatim, that Yirmiyahu was not machzir. So it turns out everybody's going to be maida that all 12 tribes are going to come together under Mashiach. Right? That's a pashat teretz, basically. Okay. But then the question still becomes, what exactly is the machlekes Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Eliezer? Because he now goes to the second text that says that they were exiled to, at least the first Mar Zutra says, they were exiled to Africa. They were exiled to Afrika, it says. The Maharal assumes, as it sounds, that this is referring to Africa. So, frek the Maharal, how could there be? So it turns out, if there's a machlokes, if they're asid and lachzor, not asid and lachzor, according to Mar Zutra, they're arguing: are they going to return from Africa or not? So, frek the Maharal, there are no Jews in Africa, at least in indigenously. Now, the Radvaz actually, obviously the Maharal is not going with the Radvaz, but there are no Jews in Africa. So, Bazai, how could you be machzir? So here is what the Maharal says, very, very good. So what are you going to say? Now, this is interesting. What are you going to say? The simplest thing that you might say is, yeah, there are Jews in Africa, but they were mufla, meaning to say they intermarried, they mixed. Now, those who are goyim, meaning if there were any Jewish men who married non-Jewish women, that's not bichlal v'aseres hashvatim, simply because the kids are goyim. So nobody is saying they're going to come back because they're not Jewish. But it's also yitochen that there were Jewish women who intermingled with goyim. Now, I think that's a problem too, because, yeah, Jewish women intermarried with goyim, so the kids are Jewish. Technically, they're not of the Aseres Hashvatim. I mean, if you have a non-Jew who has a child from a Jewish woman, now what tribe? The kid is Jewish. This is a kid without a shevet. But that doesn't bother the Maharal so much, because we could say that anyone that's not from Yehuda and Binyamin, Aseres Hashvatim is like every other Jew. So you could say if they got muvla with intermarriage, you might say in such a situation that is the Aseres Hashvatim that are going to be identified and brought back. Maharal says that's not true. The Maharal actually learns that the Aseres Hashvatim never became assimilated with non-Jewish populations. The way the Maharal portrays it, now many people do not agree with this. He portrays the Aseres HaShvatim, even if they're in different places, as a cohesive group with their own community, keeping mitzvahs, faraway kingdoms. They are not muvla. Okay, we'll talk about what's the lashon of rivla being muvla. We'll get back to that. But at least generally, the Maharal does not portray the Aseres HaShvatim as people who lost a sense of their Jewish identification. Now, this is the Maharal's chiddush. This is the Maharal's assumption, actually. But the proof that he brings is from Gemara Yavamas. The Gemara Yavamas discusses the question: what is the halacha if a non-Jewish man does kedushin on a Jewish woman? So for Netzach, normally it's not a kedushin. You don't need a get. But the Gemara discusses the question: are we choshesh that maybe this guy that says he's a guy might in fact be from the women of the Aseres HaShvatim? So the Gemara says in Yavamas, we're not choshesh. We are absolutely not choshesh that a guy is from the Aseres HaShvatim because they were not muvla within those populations. So based on that, the Maharal says, so we now have a problem with Africa. How can you say the Aseres HaShvatim were exiled to Africa? There are no Jews in Africa who can be taken out of Africa. And even if you're going to try to answer to me, well, there are Jews who got muvla in non-Jewish populations, that didn't happen. So based on the Maharal's Hanacha, based on the Gemara in Yavamas, what does it mean they were exiled to Africa? And then there's a machlekes Hasid and Lachzor. So here the Maharal says a chiddush in Pshat, which is not, I wouldn't say it's so mashma in the language. He says they were exiled to Africa, and then they wandered around and got reunited with the Jewish people. So the statement, Aseres HaShvatim Asid and Lachzor, just means the 10 tribes are going to return with the rest of the Jewish people to Eretz Yisrael because they are already with the rest of the Jewish people throughout the world. Meaning, it's not like you think the Aseres HaShvatim are somewhere and they're going to be united. That's how everybody learns the Rabbi Eliezer. He says, no. It means the statement, according to Rabbi Eliezer, is they are already with us, even though we don't know our tribes. And therefore, when we, well, I don't know, we might be one of them, but when any part of Klal Yisrael goes back, they're going to go back too, because they're already with us. And the statement, Galu li'Afrika, or Galu to Harei Shlug, is the initial place, and then they did that. Now, according to Rabbi Akiva, Ein Hasid and Lachzor, the assumption would be they just died there, meaning to say they were exiled to Africa. They died there. They died there. So there's no one. So you're right. There's no one to bring back. Meaning Ein Hasid and Lachzor is because they're extinct. Which means Hasid and Lachzor is they already wandered out of Africa and they're with everybody else. Ein Hasid and Lachzor means they died. But again, the Maharal is still going with the Hanacha that this is only a machlekes legabe those that Yirmiyahu was not machzir, but legabe those that Yirmiyahu was machzir, hakol maidim, that they're part of Klal Yisrael. Okay, that's how he's miyashiv the idea that there will always be all of the 12 tribes. But then he gives another pshat that, which he seems to go with more, that Africa does not mean Africa, it's somewhere else. And Einachinami. Based on that idea, there are still, now remember, the Maharal is still going with his Yesod, which he tries to prove from Yevamos, that the Aseres HaShvatim did not become absorbed in Goyim, but they remained as a separate Jewish population, and they're in some faraway place. It's also called Afriki, that is blocked off from the world by the Hare Choshech, mountains of darkness. And Einochinami, Asid and Lachzor means they're going to come from there. And again, Rabbi Akiva says they died. Okay, now, here the Maharal makes a very interesting point. This is actually very fascinating historically. The Maharal says, you may ask a question on me that I'm positing there's still the 10 tribes located in this unknown location. He says, the Chachmei Umos HaOlam say that they have mapped every place in the world. And there's no place in the world that has not been explored. So how can I claim there's this place where the 10 tribes live that nobody has uncovered? So the Maharal says, Shtus v'hevel. It's a davar pashat that there are places in the world that have not been explored. And here the Maharal says, just very recently, there's a place that was discovered that people call Olam Chadash. They call the New World, that nobody was aware that it existed until very recently. He is talking about the discovery of North America, Columbus. Maharal lived in the 1500s. Columbus is 1492. And this is, the Maharal mentions 2 or 3 places. Maharal mentions America as, although he doesn't use the word America or whatever. I'm not sure what it was called. Was it called America? I don't know what it was. It was not the United States, of course. That wasn't until the Revolutionary War. But okay. So based on the 2 pshatim of the Maharal about Africa, it's a very interesting, totally different picture. According to his first pshat, that Africa meant Africa, there are no 10 tribes as a separate unit. They're already totally moved. Well, either they died out, like Rabbi Akiva, or they just rejoined the Jewish people wandering around. And Asid and Lachzor doesn't mean they're going to come back from a place. It just means they'll return to Eretz Yisrael with everybody else. So according to that view, the 10 tribes are not lost at all. The 10 tribes are totally muvla within Am Yisrael. Like the second pshat, there is this mysterious kingdom of the 10 tribes that is located in a place that civilization has not yet identified. And if I hold Asid and Lachzor, they will come from there. And if I hold Ein Asid and Lachzor, it would be the same explanation. Not that they're going to continue their kingdom, their rival kingdom, after Mashiach comes. Rather, they died out and they became an extinct nation. But the Maharal's point is the following. Maharal's point is that the Aseres Hashvatim never became separated from Hashem. They became separated from the rest of Am Yisrael, the Iker of Am Yisrael, which is Yehuda and Binyamin. They were the Iker because they were the Makam HaMikdash. And therefore, this is not a period from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It is a period from Am Yisrael. Now, I have to say that this is not Yud Gimel Ikrei Emunah. I mean, there are many, many Shitas that have a different view. But I will say, in the Maharal's time, it was a very common belief that the 10 tribes were somehow a great, great wealthy kingdom in a faraway place. And there are even stories about isolated people who claim to have come from there, who have claimed to be from there, Sarasashvatim, who talk about the fantastic wealth that was there. The Maharal is going with that Havana, meaning as opposed to the Radvaz, who is looking at the Aseres Hashvatim as a Muvla population. And as opposed to, a lot of people think that the Afghanis, the Pashtun tribe, 30 million people who practice Islam are really part of the 10 tribes. That's looking at the 10 tribes as assimilating. Maharal says no, they never assimilated. Either they died out totally, that's Rabbi Akiva Shita, or they reabsorbed into the Klal Yisrael. That's the Maharal's first shot in Rabbi Eliezer, or they still have their super kingdom somewhere past the Hare Chayshech or Sambatyain, those different things. But the one model Maharal is not using the notion of an assimilated population. So those things that say, for example, the American Indians are from the 10 tribes, Maharal would not accept that. Those that say the Vikings are from the 10 tribes, Maharal would not accept that. Pashtuns, because these are not people who practice Yiddishkeit. And Maharal is saying the Aseret HaShvatim did not separate themselves from Torah and mitzvos. They simply were, because of Hashem's wrath, they were simply cast to a very, very far place. According to Rabbi Akiva, the Gezerah was so chamor that they died out. According to Rabbi Eliezer, it's going to be Asid and Lachzer. Okay, so again, it's important to make this point because the Maharal's description of the Aseret HaShvatim is very, very different than the Radvaz's kind of description, at least of Shevet Dan. Yeah, now I remember the name. If you Google Prester John, at least that's how the Christians love this more than Jews. Christians loved these legendary stories of people from the lost 10 tribes showing up. It became really part of Christian folklore. But there were Jewish communities involved as well. So Prester John, I don't know what his Hebrew name would be, but he's a character, probably a fraud actually, but he's a character who claimed to come from this faraway kingdom. By the way, there was a great fascination with these lost tribes. I mean, the Kuzari. The Kuzari is a book of philosophy, but it's based on the story of a warlike tribe in Russia who converted to Judaism. In fact, some say the whole Ashkenazi Jewry comes from the Khazars. Okay, that's probably not true either. It says it's not the Jews who were smart; the Khazars are smart, right? They say it's not. Jews themselves were not so natively bright, but the Khazars were very, very intelligent. So that's whatever. But be it as it may, it's a true story. There was a tribe that converted, but the reason Rav Yehuda Halevi, Kuzari is a book of Jewish philosophy, of course. So why did he have to connect it to a story? Because people loved that story. It was like a novel. People loved that story of that faraway population that converted to Judaism. So Rav Yehuda Halevi wanted to teach the philosophical ideas of Judaism in the framework of that story. So the story is true, but the dialogue is all made up, meaning Rav Yehuda Halevi is teaching his hashkafas. So when it says the king asked and the chaver answered, Rav Yehuda Halevi is writing the whole script. There was no record of any conversation, but he's using the story in order to convey the hashkafa and the ideas, and that's because this was a story that really got people interested, got people excited, and the same thing was true with the sporadic contacts with the 10 tribes, and that's the Prester John. But again, as I say, the Maharal is Badafka rejecting the notion that they became Muvla. Now, the only question is, Maharal doesn't address it. The one thing Maharal does not explain is, well, what about the Medrash that I read, that the Maharal brought, that at least talks about group number 3, right? One was exiled to Sambatyon, one was beyond Sambatyon, and the third group was Bedafna, the suburbs of Rivla, and they were Muvla there. It is Yitachen that maybe one group did get assimilated. On the other hand, the Maharal doesn't seem to go that way because the Maharal says, based on the Gemara Yevamos, that any guy who's Makadosh and Isha, you're never Chayshish from Aseret HaShvatim, that means that none of the Aseret HaShvatim were Muvla as Goyim. Because if you're going to tell me, B'dafna Shel Rivla, they were Muvla in that sense, then you got a problem. Why does the Gemara say you're not Chayshish for Kedushin? So the Maharal seems to learn Muvla does not mean they didn't know they were Jewish, that they didn't know they were Jewish. It means, Muvla just means we don't know where they are. Meaning they're Rachak, we don't know where they are. Although, again, I don't fully get it because L'chaira, that would be equally true of the other two groups. I mean, if the point simply is Muvla in the sense we don't know where they are, so that's true for everything. I mean, what is miyuchad about group number 3? So the Maharal is not masber this in a full way, but he does say generally that there is a gezerah from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that at least until the Zman of the Geula, we will not, in spite of these Prester John occasional people, we will not really know where the Aseres HaShvatim are. They do exist as a separate, like the Maharal's second shot, they exist as a separate entity, but we will not know where they are. And number one, we will not get there. Even with modern technology, we will not find them. And number two, we won't even know where they are with satellites or whatever it is. That's the gezerah of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That's a chelik of the gezerah. Even if you go like Rabbi Eliezer, Asidim Masha, like Rabbi Akiva, they're already extinct. So I'm precarious. I was going to say extinct like the dinosaurs, but there are no dinosaurs. So okay. They're totally extinct. It's Rabbi Akiva. Like Rabbi Eliezer, they're there, but we're not going to be able to find them, which is a big claim, really, because technology, you can go, there are these, what do they call them? There are some, well, I don't remember the language, a tribe that has no contact with other human beings. What are they called? Uncontacted, that's right. But even the uncontacted tribes, like we know they exist. I mean, right. In fact, there are laws. You're not allowed to go. There are certain islands that in India, or whatever, off the coast of India, where other countries, where you're not allowed to go within 5 miles of the island. They have police there because this is an uncontacted people. And if you go, they're likely to kill you or whatever it is. Also, spread of disease. I mean, this is actually one of the things that happened to Indians when European explorers started exploring the Americas. They brought all sorts of diseases, which Europeans had developed a natural immunity because they've been with those diseases for thousands of years, and they come to a place that didn't have that at all. And even a relatively simple cold, a particular germ, could wipe out populations. So really, there were, besides the bloodshed of the explorers, they were Reitzchem, very, very vicious Reitzchem, but many, many, many native populations died from diseases. So they have uncontacted people, but the interesting question is, are there uncontacted people that we don't know about? Maharal says, yeah, and among them are the Aseres HaShvatim. And the Aseres HaShvatim are not a primitive uncontacted people. It's mamish. Who knows what they have? Advanced technology. Who knows what they have? Maybe they have a spaceship going to Mars or something. But a whole society that it's a gezerah of HaKadosh Baruch Hu that we're not going to be able to even know where they are until the coming of Mashiach. And the Maharal brings a very, very interesting dimion to this. We have a famous rule, Maisa Avais Siman Labanim, famous klal, that everything that happens to the Avais is a siman of what is going to happen to Klal Yisrael. And the Ramban uses this in Chumash Bereshis over and over and over and over again. Avram goes to Mitzrayim because of a Rav. So that's a Giloi that Yaakov Ubanev are going to go to Mitzrayim because of a Rav. When Avram leaves Mitzrayim, he leaves with Matanais Gedolos. That's a Siman Labanim that we're going to leave Mitzrayim with Rechush Gadol. All of these things. Yitzchak digs wells and the wells get filled up. That's a remez. There are 2 wells that get filled up, and the third well stays. That's a remez to the 2 Batei Mikdash that are going to be destroyed, and the third Beis HaMikdash is never going to be destroyed. The Ramban, Kimat, through all of Chumash Bereshis, the Ramban shows Maisa Avais on Siman Labanim. So here the Maharal says, one Maisa Avais Siman Labanim is the separation of Yosef from his brothers for 22 years. Now, this is a bit of a stretch because, on one hand, most of the 10 tribes were with Yaakov. But he wants to say like this. This is what he says. He says that the Iker Chelak of the Aseres HaShvatim is Shevet Ephraim, because all of the kings of the 10 Shvatim, always came from Shevet Ephraim. Just like in Eretz Yehuda, the Malachim came from Yehuda, except for Shaul HaMelech. In Malchus Yisrael, all of the Malachim come from Shevet Ephraim. Mimela, he says, Yosef, who is the progenitor of Shevet Ephraim, represents in microcosm the Aseres Hashvatim. Even though most of the Aseres Hashvatim were on the other side, they were in Eretz Yisrael. And therefore, Yosef's separation from his brothers is a Maisa Avai Simin Labanim of the Aseres Hashvatim being separated from the Ikar of Klal Yisrael, which is Yehuda. And not only are they separated, but it's significant that for those 22 years, they had no idea where Yosef was. They had no idea. They didn't know where he was. Like that's the whole kasha. Why didn't Yosef send a postcard? Whatever it would be. And he says that's Maisa Avais, that not only will there be a separation until a reunification, but the separation will be a Zah separation where you don't even know where he is. And that's exactly the story. The brothers or Yaakov did not know where Yosef was. And the Maharal says that is Nichlal in the Maisa Avai Simin Labanim. And he brings from the Medrash that when Yosef got reunited with his brothers, there was a bechi, there was crying. The crying, again, the crying is an interesting thing. It's a crying of joy and also a crying of sadness for all the years that we were separated, and a crying of charata, of regret and remorse of the brothers for what they did to Yosef. It's a very complex type of crying. Simcha, bechi, mariras. So the Medrash says, kishem, that when Yosef gets reunited with his brothers, it was through bechia. So too, when the Aseres Hashvatim get reunited, there will be the bechi of simcha, and the bechi of the sadness that so many years we were separated. Okay, so that's the Maharal's take on this. Now, the next thing that he says though is he now talks about the three groups. Now again, he doesn't. I mean, the truth is, the Gemara in Sanhedrin has a machlokas. Were they sent to Africa, whatever that means, or Hare Salug, wherever that is? Then we have a Medrash that gives you different locations. So I don't even know how to correlate the locations. But in the Medrash, right, one says Sambatyain. I'm sorry, one, it's not a machlokas, but three groups. One group, Sambatyain. The other group, past Sambatyain, meaning the same distance of Eretz Yisrael to Sambatyain. The second group went from Sambatyain, that same distance. And the third went to Daifna Shel Rivla, and they will be come up with Mechilais. So here is what the Maharal says. The Maharal says that the idea of these subterranean tunnels is not meant to be literal. In fact, this is actually a klal gadol in Maharal. Maharal was actually a gadol ador in Psak Halacha. People don't recognize the Maharal's gadlus in halacha because most of his svarim are not on halacha. But he was considered to be one of the great poskim of the time. In fact, he's very interesting. He lived at the time of the Shulchan Aruch and the Ramah, and he actually was opposed to the Shulchan Aruch. He did not like what the Shulchan Aruch represented, because for the Maharal, it says every posek should go back to the Gemara, to the Rishonim, and then determine what the halacha is. And if that means one Rav says this for his Kehila, and another Rav says that, Beseder, Kachi Darka Shel Torah, that a Psak halacha has to emerge from a Havana of the Sugya. Now, he looked at the Shulchan Aruch the way people might look at Cliff Notes or whatever, in which you have somebody, even a great person like Rav Yosef Karo or the Ramah, telling you what the din is. So the Maharal actually said that's going to create amaratzis, because people will just open up these books and give you a rule. It will also create a lack of understanding because the MS says you can't even apply the Shulchan Aruch unless you understand the Gemara. So the Maharal was mamish misnaged to the idea of a Shulchan Aruch. He also felt Shulchan Aruch was disrespectful to local minhagim, meaning in Poland, Germany, different cities had different psukim. Now, you might say that's a chisaron. We shouldn't have two Torahs. Maharal felt it was a milah. Different cities, different communities, not cities, but communities have different hachros. They should be allowed to. They should be allowed to do that. Not only was the Maharal against the Shulchan Aruch, but the Marshal was against for the same reason. If you look, the Marshal wrote, besides his Hagos on Shas, which are very indispensable. I mean, he more or less established them. People don't appreciate the Marshal because you look at the Marshal in the back, and he's saying Tzarech Lomar this, Tzarech Lomar this. Well, the Gemara says it. Like, what is he telling me here? Well, the answer is the Gemara says it because he said it. I mean, basically, he did establish the nusach of the Talmud Bavli based on looking at Rishonim and looking at manuscripts and the like. So the fact that you can look at the Marshal in the back and not see that many chidushim, it's because all of the things he did were incorporated in. That's why in the new Oz V'Hadar, they have an expanded Marshal. It's actually, I mean, if you're into, you have to be into this. They actually show you what the girsa in front of the Marshal was. Because then you see, in other words, they trace the manuscripts and the dates, and they say, in front of the Marshal, this is what it said, and the Marshal was Magia. You see, in the normal Vilna Shas, you don't know what the original girsa, what the prior girsa was. Same thing with Rashi. Rashi, a lot of times, Rashi did a lot of it before the Marshal. Rashi says, Hachi Garsinan. So you're wondering, Hachi Garsinan is like what our Gemara says. So like, what's Rashi? The answer is the Gemara said it because the printers corrected it based on Rashi. Now, sometimes Rashi gives you a Hachi Garsinan that's actually different than the Gemara. That's an obvious chiddush. Why the printers didn't follow Rashi then, I don't know. But most of the Hachi Garsinans are what the Gemara says. But the answer is, it says it because of Rashi. Which is interesting, by the way, because l'chayra, that's a violation of Rabbeinu Tam's chayrim. It's interesting. Rashi's own grandson, the great Rabbeinu Tam. And the Rivash writes about the godless of Rabbeinu Tam. He says, Meshunadik godless. He says, Rabbeinu Tam he considered greater than the Rambam. Not everybody would agree, but he says, yeah. And then he says, with a little bit of hesitation, Ulai, Yaiser Miziknei. Perhaps, even greater than the grandfather. I mean, the grandfather is Rashi. So Rabbeinu Tam was Meshunadik great. He was the younger brother of the Rashbam, of Shmuel ben Meir. So Rabbeinu Tam actually issued a cherem on not changing a girsa in the text itself. That if you have this is before printing. If you have a manuscript and you're convinced it's wrong and it's a mistake, and it's very shaykh that it's a mistake, it says never change it. You don't know. If you have a haga'ah, put it on the side, near Ali, shetzarech lomar kach. Because maybe somebody else could be miyashiv the girsa. And therefore, that's why the Bach, for example, the Hagos HaBach, are not, the Gemara is not corrected. It's a Haggah, because the Bach is following Rabbeinu Tam's rule that you don't change a Sefer, which means ideally, in fact, the Marshal didn't change. In fact, the printers did this. The Marshal didn't change the Sefer. Marshal wrote Hagos, like the Bach. Rashi also didn't change the Sefer. Rashi said Hachi Garsinan. It's the printers who actually violated Rabbeinu Tam's cherem by incorporating. They thought they could sell more Gemaras that way. They incorporated the Haggais of Rashi and later the Marshal and others as well into the actual text of the Gemara, which is connected to Rabbeinu Tam's cherem, because and that's why you'll find. I mean, you'll find in Rishonim that there are machleksim about girsais. See, how can you change? You don't change something. You have to say, some are goris this, some are goris this, some are goris this, and then people who learn will try to figure out which girsa they should follow. Okay, be it as it may, the reason I mention this is really as an aside. The Maharal wrote, in addition to the Hagais, which is called Chachmas Shlomo, he wrote a sefer. I think it's on the shelf here. Yam Shel Shlomo. Yam Shel Shlomo is on 8 or 10 Masechtas, Beya, Ksubas, Gittin. And Yam Shel Shlomo, on the Masechtas that he takes, he doesn't take all the Masechtas, is really a halacha sefer, but it's a halacha sefer that's very, very different than the Shulchan Aruch. He goes through the sugyas. Each sugya, he will go through the lumdus of the sugya to be machriya a halacha lemaisa. So it is a halacha lemaisa sefer, but it's based on connecting it to a havana of the Gemara itself. And because of this, the Maharal says that he considered this to be a much better derech than the Shulchan Aruch, that just gives you the rules. Says, I have to give you the process. I have to give you. In fact, this goes back to a time on the Rambam. People, the Breitowitz said to the Rambam, about the Rambam, why don't you give us Makairis? To this day, I mean, it started with the Maggid Mishnah, but today people are still declaring about different Makairis for the Rambam. Rav Chaim Kanievsky identified a number of Makairis. There are a few that he didn't get, maybe lost in Midrashim. In fact, the Rambam writes in a letter, a fascinating thing. The Rambam writes in a letter, because somebody asked him, why don't you tell us where you get these things from? So the Rambam said, the Rambam had a little defense. He says, if I'm going to give you like all the Gemaras that I got it from, then I'll just be repeating Shas. I wrote the Sefer, so you don't have to get involved in everything. So you tell me just bring it all in. He says, I would be defeating the purpose. But he said the following. He said, I'll tell you a Maisa. He said, the Rambam lived in Cairo. That was his place. One of the Dayanim on my beis din brought over to me Hilchos Reitzeach in the Mishnah Torah. And he gave and the Dayan must be an older Dayan because he talks to the Rambam a little disrespectfully. He says to the Rambam, read this. So the Rambam reads it. The Rambam says, what's the problem? He says, where'd you get that from? So the Rambam said right away, the Rambam writes this, right away, well, listen, it's about Ir Miklat. So the sugyas of Ir Miklat are in Elohein HaGoylin, the second parak of Makkos. The Rambam says, must be second parak of Makkos. Dayan said, wrong. I learned all of Elohein HaGoylin. This is not there. So the Rambam says, the Rambam was a little discombobulated. He says, maybe you show me. He says, look there, not there. So the Rambam told the Dayan, he says, listen, why don't you go home, go have lunch, and I'm going to try to find it. And the Rambam was machapis for like an hour, figured out. And remember, in those days, you didn't even have printed chasin. I mean, you didn't even have dafim, so to speak. You had to somehow find it. And it turned out to be Agav in the middle of Yavamas. There was a line there in Akasha from which the Rambam was Maitzi Halacha. And the Rambam then said, if even I, who was the Mechaber of the Sefer, could not remember where I got it from, then how can I expect the reader to be able to know? So the Rambam said that if he had the Kayach, he would write a supplementary. He wouldn't put it in the Mishnah Torah Gufa, because that would make it too long and that would defeat the purpose. But I would write a supplementary, like footnotes volume. But even then, this wasn't complete. He says, I'm not going to give the Makairis for things that are in their normal place. But anything that's not in the normal place, I would be Mitzayin. This is Mesechus Shabbos, Mesechus Gittin, Mesechus Shavamas. And he actually was mischarit because he writes in the letter, he says, I got stumped. He says, I couldn't remember where this thing was. I mean, it took him an hour, but he said eventually he was able to retrieve it. So people don't realize that the Maharal himself had a tremendous gadlus in halacha, but the Maharal's fame is agadata. Now, the Maharal shita of agadata is a very important shita because the Maharal actually, people raise the question: Is Agadata true or not true? People ask the question that way. Is it emes or is it not emes? Did Esther have a tail? Did Esther not have a tail? Was Moshe 20 amas tall, or is it above a Moshe? Maharal says, as Rambam said before him, that that's a false question. To ask the question, is Agadata true or false, is not, those are not the choices. Because Avada Agadata is true. But the truth of Agadata is lav dafka literal. Chazal use stories, parables, and mishalim to convey ideas in Ruchnius. And those ideas in Ruchnius are Teiras Hashem. But the outer levush are just ways that we could be makabel those things. So is Agadata true? Yeah, of course it's true. Is it literal? Lav dafka. Now, some people don't like that. Some people say that's apikorsis, but this is really the mahalach of the Maharal, that much Agadata, not all Agadata, much Agadata is symbolic and metaphor. And here he says the idea of mechilais, the idea, now again, he doesn't explain why only this third group. That's not, but this idea that the Aseres HaShvatim come back to Eretz Yisrael under the caves. The Maharal says that Vadai is not meant to be literal. It expresses a certain spiritual idea. And one of the spiritual ideas is the following idea, and that is that when you plant a seed in the ground, before the seed starts growing into a plant, it first disintegrates. In other words, it actually loses its old state, and then it begins to germinate. And so too by Geula, Maharal says generally, we have to kind of be like a seed in which we lose our old identity in order to acquire a new identity. So the notion of going under mechilais is a remez, to be planted in the ground, so to speak. You're coming up from the ground. And therefore you're like a bria chadasha, in which there's an obliteration of the ego. You become a new Messias. Now again, that's a beautiful explanation, but it doesn't fully explain why would that bedafka be for the third group of the Aseres HaShvatim. L'chara, it would apply not only to the Aseres HaShvatim, it would seemingly apply to everybody. That you have to kind of obliterate the ego before you're able to be Zaycha to Geulas Hashem. Okay, but as I say, just as a general idea of Mechilos, the notion of Mechilos is that in order for you to get from the Golas to Eretz Yisrael, you have to be like something that's planted in the ground. And then you emerge from the ground, and then you become a Bria Chadasha by obliterating the old ego. In fact, this is, Maharal will say weiter, that this is part of the message of Chavlei Mashiach. Why do things have to be so bad until they become good? Because when things are not bad, we have a certain arrogance, we have a certain gaiva. I can accomplish all of these things. And when you're filled with your ego, whether it's my politics, my science, I'm not ready for Geula. So what does HaKadosh Baruch Hu do? He sends us COVID, which makes us realize that all of our sophisticated medicine is not going to help us. And then Israel, which has the best, by far, the best military security in the world. And October 7th, people still can't explain. How does Hamas have, whatever it is, 6 hours to go around murdering people? How do they get through the fence? How could they not be detected? How could the systems fail? It's a real kasha. Israel has a really top notch, much better than the United States in terms of security. But what is HaKadosh Baruch Hu showing us? You have bitachon in your science. I give you COVID. You have bitachon in your military. I give you October 7th. Right? So what is all of this? By showing us that we're so not in control, we become like the seed that gets destroyed. But al yedei, its destruction, It has a new growth. Ein lanu l'hishayin ela al avinu shabashamayim. So the Maharal says, in a general sense, that is the inyan of mechilas. You got to go under the ground, and then you come up at the other end like a new tzmicha. But again, as I say, it is a little schwer because this doesn't quite explain why bedafka, that particular group, but symbolically, this is the general idea of the mechilas, and this is a good illustration of the Maharal showing that agadas are not meant to be literal. Now, the Emet says, the Rambam says the same thing way before the Maharal, but it's interesting. The Rambam promised the following. The Rambam says, some agadatas are literal. Chazal had certain traditions as to things that happened at different times. Many agadatas are symbolic. And the Rambam says, B'ezras Hashem, I will write a sefer that will tell you which midrashim are literal and which midrashim are symbolic. Litzarenu, we don't have that sefer. so right now we don't know. So we look at Maharal. Maharal is mafarish many agadatas. Although it's an interesting thing, in addition to all of this, every sefer of Maharal is mafarish agadat. That's what he does. But there is a sefer Chidushei Agada on Masechtas, in which he goes through the agadatas in every Masechta. But it's very, very strange that the first Masechta is Masechas Shabbos. There's no Chidushei Maharal on Maseches Brachos. That's a very, very strange thing, because Maseches Brachos is one of the biggest collections of Agadata in Shas. So why he didn't give us that? You never know. A person didn't get to it, whatever. He started doing other things and other Masechtas first. But we don't have a Chidushei Maharal on Maseches. Well, actually, we do have a Chidushei Maharal on Maseches Brachos on Halacha, actually, on Halacha. But in terms of the Chidushei Agada Maharal, we actually do not have. Okay, but this is his take on the Aser Shvatim. Again, the interesting thing is just historically that the Maharal wants to ensure you that, like every single Mandi Amar, all of the tribes are going to be around when Mashiach comes, because the whole machlokas are only those who didn't come back with Yirmiyahu, right? And Akol Maidim, some did come back with Yirmiyahu, so that's in his reserve, that's going to guarantee. And then the other point is that if they're not extinct, they did not become assimilated with Goyim. They remain a separate group, but in a place that we will never be able to find and we will never be able to identify until the Zman of Geula, and that is based on Maisa Avai Simin Labanim of Yosef and his brothers. Okay, have a good Shabbos.